Okay. Thank you for Jerome and the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about the EnderScope project. This is an open source, low-cost microscope that we've made. And I recognize there's a lot of people here who are very passionate about open hardware. So I don't need to preach to you how good open hardware is. So I'm not going to. And instead, what I'm going to do is talk about the process of how we put this microscope together and what we learned throughout the process, and mistakes we made and tips. So to start off, why did we make this microscope in the first place? My PhD is focused on measuring microplastics in seawater samples. So if you want to measure microplastics in seawater, there's two ways you can go about that. The first involves techniques like FTIR or Raman spectroscopy. And these techniques can be good. They can tell you not only how much plastic is in your sample, but also what type of plastic. The only downside to these techniques is that they're quite expensive, with the instruments costing tens of thousands of euros. And while that might be a suitable solution for a research lab in Ireland or Europe, for example, there's many places around the world that will not be able to afford tools like these. And microplastic pollution is a global problem, so if we want to tackle it, we need globalizable, scalable solutions. So there are cheaper methods of measuring microplastics from seawater, one of which is where you take a sample of seawater and you digest away all the organic material, so plants, animals, and then you filter the remaining inorganic material through a filter paper, and this should catch the plastics. Then, to be able to see the plastics better, you stain the filter paper with a fluorescent dye called Nile red, and then you can manually count how many plastics are in your sample with fluorescence microscopy. So while this method is much cheaper, it's quite time-consuming because you have to sit at the fluorescence microscope and manually count how many plastics are there. So we were thinking, can we do better than this? Can we make an instrument that is going to be cost-effective but also time-efficient? So possibly we could go with this cheaper Nile red staining method, but automate it. So have an automated scanning fluorescence microscope that was cheap. So that's what we said we would do. We would build this microscope. And when we were thinking about how to build this microscope, the main inspiration came from 3D printers. So 3D printers have these fantastic scanning mechanisms that are very precise. It's easily controlled with G-code, and the best thing is that it's already done. I don't have to build it because I've tried building linear translation stages before, and it's just difficult because it has to be perfectly aligned. So I said, maybe we could use the motion of the 3D printer and just put a microscope on top, and then we have a scanning microscope. So that's what we did. We said we would use a low-cost 3D printer and put a microscope on it, and then we can have a scanning microscope. The 3D printer we chose is an Ender 3 Pro, and we chose this because it is low cost. You can get one for maybe 150 to 200 euro, and therefore we called it the EnderScope, because I'm not very creative when it comes to names. And also, it autocorrects to endoscope all the time, so it's probably not the best name choice, but it's stuck now. So, if this instrument is going to be a scalable, accessible solution for microplastic pollution, we need to reduce all the barriers to entry for people to be able to reproduce this. So it needs to be affordable, which is why we chose the Ender 3 Pro 3D printer. It needs to be accessible, so the Ender is quite a ubiquitous entry-level 3D printer. It needs to have a simple design so people can actually follow along and reproduce it, and it needs to be open source so that there's no barrier to sharing the design. So I had the scanning mechanism of the microscope. That's the 3D printer, that's sorted. Now I needed to build a microscope that would go onto my 3D printer. And this is where my first tip comes in, and that is to steal ideas from other objects or open source projects that are around you. And it's not really stealing, it's more taking inspiration. So I look around the lab and I see, for example, old microscopes lying around. I try to replicate these mechanisms so that the videos aren't playing, but when I was looking for a filter slider, because this is going to be a fluorescence microscope, I need to make a way of moving the fluorescence filter in and out. So I would look at old microscopes and say, oh, this has a nice objective changer. Maybe I can make it into something 3D printable. And then I try it. And I was looking at objective lens turrets. Maybe I could do something like this and 3D print it. And not all of these designs were any good. Some of them were terrible. And that's okay, because my second tip is to reiterate your designs. So then we moved on to this ball bearing mechanism where you can move the filter into place. And you'll see that each time you do a design, it will just get simpler naturally. Sometimes our first instinct is to overcomplicate things, but every time you do it again and again, it will get simpler. And eventually my design for the filter changer ended up like this, which is much simpler, easy to 3D print, and you just put the filter under those little notches. This wasn't me that designed this. This was designed by Vittorio Saggiomo, who's a researcher in the Netherlands. And Vittorio has a fantastic eye for looking at something and making it simple. He just knows how to design things so that they can be 3D printed easily without supports or any complications like that. So that's my third tip, is to collaborate with people. So I don't have all the expertise. There are lots of things I'm not good at. But if you want to make your project as best as it can be, you can collaborate with other people to get their input, and your project will be the better for it. So Vittorio designed the lens tube and the filter slider. I'm terrible at coding. This is my first coding project, so it's just me and ChatGPT trying to put something together. But for the coding, I needed help. I didn't have that expertise, so I reached out to Gesine and Amy, and they helped with the coding. And then for the user interface, I got some help from Jerome, again, because this is just not my area of expertise. So that would be my third tip, is just to lean on the people around you to make your project better. So all of us put our heads together, and this is the final design that we came up with for the microscope that's going to go on our 3D printer. So the aim here was to try and make it as low cost as possible. So instead of using a traditional objective lens, we use this low-cost objective lens from Amazon that you can get for €9. Instead of using a traditional microscopy camera, we use a Raspberry Pi high-quality camera that's about €40. Instead of using expensive LEDs, we use simple LED rings that are about €10. And for the fluorescence filter, instead of using the commercial glass fluorescence filters, we use lighting gels, which are thin pieces of plastic that are commonly used in photography or the entertainment industry. And there's a lovely video here, but this red filter blocks out that green light really well. So it can be used for fluorescence with the green light. And then all the other parts, we just 3D print in the middle. So again, just to minimize cost. So one of my favorite parts about this design, the video is not playing, but I'll describe it to you, is that there's a 3D printed quick change mechanism on the EnderScope. So you can have the microscope attached, you move the lever, you can take it off and put the original print head of the printer back on. So this means that you can print the parts that you need for the microscope with your printer, take the print head off, use the microscope, and go back and forth. So you don't have to sacrifice your 3D printer to have a microscope. You can have two tools in one. And then this is the final EnderScope. I wonder, can I play some of these videos? No, that's okay. This is the final EnderScope, and it can basically scan over a big filter paper, take multiple images, stitch them together, and then count how many plastics are there. So this is just to prove to you that it works. We have some Nile red stained fluorescent microplastics here. You can then threshold those images and pull out information like the size of the particle, the area of the particle, and you can do that for your whole sample. So now we had our design, it was time to share it on GitHub. So this is the open source repository where we put the assembly instructions, the STL files, the software. Basically, you should have everything you need from the GitHub to reproduce your own EnderScope. And that we also published this. I always forget to tell people that, but we did. So if the proof a few slides ago that this works wasn't enough for you, you can read this and find more proof that works. And after we shared this to the scientific community through GitHub and through the publication, we started to notice that researchers were reproducing this. So the Open Flexure group in Glasgow in Scotland are building an EnderScope. We have an EnderScope being built in Trinity College Dublin. We have an EnderScope being built in Maryland in the United States. They have this group, David Rousseau in France, who has released 3 YouTube videos on the EnderScope, one in which includes a 10-minute talk. This has nothing to do with me, which is amazing. That's 3 more EnderScope YouTube videos than I've ever produced. And it just goes to show you that this has kind of left our hands and is now in the hands of the scientific community, which is just very lovely. And that people aren't just reproducing the EnderScope, they're also modifying it, which is great. Because we have released this under a specific type of open source hardware license that allows you to modify the EnderScope in whatever way you want. So this is the CERN Open Hardware License permissive version. So we're not just getting replicas of the EnderScope, we're getting modifications. So here are the first 2 EnderScope variants that were created around this time last year at MIFOBio. And this was Jerome and Hugo who made these. And they did a demonstration to other researchers about how the EnderScope works. And you can actually see one of these modifications outside. But I don't think it includes the coffee cup anymore. I think that was an early prototype. So for Jerome's EnderScope, Jerome was looking at these fluorescent cress seeds. And he wanted to monitor seed growth over time. So he needed something that could do fluorescence, but also multi-well time-lapse imaging. So he used a different 3D printer, an Ender 2 instead of an Ender 3, and a different Raspberry Pi camera. And he made his own 3D printed parts and modified the code so that it can do multi-well time-lapse imaging. The video, oops, it's not playing, but it's doing a time-lapse there of those cress seeds growing. And it can also do fluorescence. And also did some time-lapse of slime mold as well. And then for Hugo's EnderScope, used a different 3D printer again, Ender 3 S1, but the same Raspberry Pi camera, but created a whole set of new 3D printed parts that allow the EnderScope to be compatible with commercial fluorescence filters and beam splitters, which is fantastic, and that's the version that you can see outside later on. And then both Jerome and Hugo made some kind of quality of life improvements to the interface as well to make it kind of easier to use. And there's an even better version of the interface in the demo outside as well. So there's some really interesting modifications being made where researchers are taking this instrument and modifying it for their specific experiment. And then the last modification is that I've seen is the Présentation, which is basically the Ender, but on a different 3D printer, so using a Prusa printer instead of an Ender. So that just shows how this design can be adapted for a different 3D printer. And this was made by a group in Mexico. So this is what happens when we share this design with people who have expertise in 3D printing and optics. But what happens when we share this with people who have different expertise? So what happens when we share with the public? Why can't the public get involved in this? There is definitely no shortage of creativity and talent among the public. You only have to go to maker events to see that. People are building robots and bionic arms. We've seen it. We go to a maker fair in Dublin called Dublin Maker every year. And there's also no shortage of enthusiasm for people getting involved in science either. And for that, you only have to look at the people who spend their weekends doing beach cleans, water surveys. So it seems that people have this talent that we should probably tap into if we want to solve global challenges like microplastic pollution. It seems that people have an interest in getting involved in science. And also, these kind of global problems like microplastic pollution, they involve the public, so the public deserve to be part of the solution if they want to be. So, what's stopping them? Because the EnderScope is online on GitHub, and technically they can Google it, anyone here can Google it, access all the information that they need to reproduce the EnderScope, and they can go and measure microplastics in their local environment. But the thing is, they probably won't. And we think that this is an issue with confidence in thinking that they can do something like this. And the reason why we think that is because of our field work that we do, where part of our PhD, we have to go down to the sea quite regularly. And when we're down in the sea, it's a public place. We meet people, we talk to people. They're always interested in what we're doing because we have big butterfly nets and we're wearing weird life jackets, so that's interesting. And we tell them what we're doing, and they're always very kind of eager to know more. But they always say, I wouldn't be able to do that. That's too difficult, too complicated, and it's out of my reach. They think it's too hard. So it kind of goes to show you that you can put all this effort into making your tool low cost, open source, easy to build, but you can't actually make people build it. That is a confidence thing that needs to be fixed first. So this gave us the idea that we would apply for funding from University College Dublin and the Experiment Foundation to make 10 EnderScopes and give them to community groups. But we're not just going to give it to them. We're going to have a workshop and provide support and do confidence building so people understand that this is not outside of their reach. It's easy, it's fun, and it's not too difficult. So what we're doing, we've picked 10 different groups around Ireland, and we're giving them a box like this with all the parts, all the instructions, a 3D printer, everything you need to make an EnderScope. And the deal is, the EnderScope is theirs to keep forever. They can use the EnderScope for whatever they want. They don't have to look at microplastics, they can look at whatever interests them. We will offer support and workshops, so we will make sure that these people feel confident in using the EnderScope, and we can hold their hands through that process if needs be. And then in a couple of months, we're just going to ask for some feedback on what was the challenges, what did you find easy, what did you find hard, what is the barriers for community groups to engage in something like this. So we have picked our 10 groups and we tried to make them as diverse as possible in terms of their interests. So we have some educational institutions, community groups, and environmental groups. And we tried to diversify them as well in terms of their geographical location in Ireland. So Dublin is, I don't know, there. So this would be like the highest population, the highest density of people in Ireland. So we try to venture a little bit outside of Dublin as much as possible. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these groups and their stories. So for educational institutions, we gave an EnderScope to Drogheda Institute of Further Education, which is a further education institute for school leavers and adults returning to education. And they want to use the EnderScope to teach anatomy and physiology. And they also want to use it to help they want the engineering students to collaborate with the biology students. So the engineering students will help with the building, the biology students will help with the science and the samples, and together they'll tell each other what they learned. Then we have 2 secondary schools. So secondary school in Ireland would be the equivalent of le collège and le lycée together. So I'm particularly going to talk about this school here, Moat Secondary School. So Moat is in the middle of Ireland, and there are 3 girls here in this secondary school who are doing a Young Scientist project, which is a competition in Ireland where people in secondary school, they get to make their own project, follow it through and present it. And their experiment is going to be on microplastics released from lunchboxes to see if there's any microplastics released after you microwave them. So they have surveyed their school to find out what kind of lunchboxes people use at lunchtime, and they are looking at microplastics before and after microwaving. And then we have Limerick School of Art and Design. So this is a 3rd level institution. And these are sculptors and artists. So this is so interesting because they want to use the EnderScope. They want to use the samples that they're looking at under the EnderScope as inspiration for their sculptures, which is really interesting, I think. They also wanted to they have a sustainability master's in this institution, and they want to look at the microplastics released from recycled synthetic fibers versus non-recycled to see if there's more or less. So then we move on to environmental groups. And for this we have Ballyhonus Tidy Towns, which is in the west of Ireland in County Mayo. And a Tidy Towns organisation is basically, it is what it sounds like. It's a group within a town, and they are kind of committed to making their area clean and a nicer place to live in. And there's, again, a competition. Everything has to be a competition. There's a competition for the tidiest town every year as well. But this particular branch of Tidy Towns has a citizen science group. And this citizen science group is made up of people who want to look at the water quality of a nearby river in this town. So they use these insects, these kind of little animals. The presence of them will give them an indication of what the water quality is like. So if the water quality is good, you will see these animals in green at the top, the mayfly and the caddisfly. And if the water quality is not so good, they will see the snails and the black fly more. So they want to use the EnderScope to be able to see these small animals better in water samples. And this is an image they shared with me just a few days ago of their completed EnderScope, completely with no help from me. So I'm just very proud. They did a really, really good job with no help whatsoever, so it's great. And then for community groups, we've shared an EnderScope with a makerspace called TOG in Dublin, and with a Scouts group. So this is in Leixlip, which is a place where I'm originally from. And this Scouts group, it's mostly made up of kind of children and teenagers, They want to use the EnderScope to look at the water quality of the nearby river that's near the scout den. They want to use the EnderScope to look at nature, what that looks like under a microscope, and teach the scouts about nature. And they also want to use it for a 3D printer, because they want to print little prizes for when the scouts win their challenges, like Minecraft 3D prints, or woggles they're called, which is what the scouts use to tie their scarves, the little thing in the middle. So they want to use the 3D printer as well, which I think is interesting, and they're more than welcome to do that, again, because we're not telling them what to do with this instrument. And then this is one of my favorite ones. This is a knitting group in Dublin. So these are called Crafty Creatures Knitting Group, and this combines two of my passions, knitting and microscopy. So I'm very excited about this one. So for this group, it's mostly made up of women. They meet every Thursday and they knit. And the reason they wanted an EnderScope is more so for a kind of a new project, a challenge, something to do together. And they want to examine the fibers of their work under the microscope, which I think is really interesting because it kind of ties back to where microscopy started with Antony von Leeuwenhoek, who was actually not a scientist, a textile trader who wanted to examine the fibers of the textiles with small glass beads. So I think it's really fitting that now we have this knitting group that is using a simple microscope to examine their work as well, which is really nice. And then the final group I'm going to talk about is a men's shed in Dunleary in Dublin. So the men's shed is basically where a group of men get together kind of weekly, and they do different projects together. They do wood turning and gardening, which is why this is all the goodies I got when I went to go and visit them from their garden. And they want the EnderScope. The reason why they want the EnderScope is quite interesting, because they're not particularly interested in the final product. They are more interested in the process of building the microscope together, because it's kind of a vehicle for socializing. So I think they're a really interesting group to work with. So I'm excited to see what their feedback is. So we haven't got all the feedback back. We're going to send out a proper survey, but we've got little bits of feedback so far. And I just wanted to point out one example which highlights the importance of why you should ask people for feedback. So I've written these assembly instructions myself, and I tried to do them the best I could. But how do I know if they're easy to read? You need to go and ask the people who are reading them, because I'm not going to know what's easy and what's not. I wrote them, of course I think they're perfect, but you need to ask people what their opinions are, because it's catching things that we've been missing. So for this is an example. I give them an LED ring with 3 wires, a 5-volt red wire, a black ground wire, and an input wire that's green in this image. But in the actual system that I give them a black wire, a red wire, and sometimes that input wire can be blue, green, yellow, and actually that's thrown people off, and they get very confused, and that's not something that I had anticipated, but I completely understand. This doesn't look like the picture, and it's such a small thing, but it's important, and that's why we have to ask people for their feedback. So to kind of link everything together, basically, all of these 3 things, there's a back and forth between all of them. There's a symbiosis. The EnderScope will become a better project from this feedback from the community groups, and it will improve with that. And then if the EnderScope improves, that's beneficial for me, because this is my baby and my project, and it will, it's for my PhD. That's great, professionally. But the real impact for me, I think, has been the personal impact of going to these community groups and sitting down with them. These are people I never would have met before. They taught me things I never would have learned before. They welcomed me into their groups, sat down, we had a cup of tea, and that's not an experience I would have had otherwise. So I was talking about wood turning with the men's shed. I was learning new stitches with the knitting group. I was learning what it's like to be a teenage girl in Ireland from the secondary school students. And I find that I feel this way after all citizen science that I do, all public outreach. I do quite a lot of it, and every time I come away with some kind of insight about different groups of people. And it's one of the most rewarding parts of the job, I think, and one of the most motivating parts of the job. So even though it does require a little bit of work and a little bit of planning to do it properly, once you do that, it benefits you, benefits them, there's no downsides. And then for the community groups, what do they get out of it? They have now got their own autonomous project. They're allowed to research the things that they're interested in. They've learned new skills, like how to use a microscope, how to build a microscope, how to wire a microscope. And then this microscope, the EnderScope, can become a focal point for their community to gather around. And actually, conversely, so while the EnderScope can be these kind of projects can be very important for the community groups, the other way around is true also. I think that these kind of communities are the key to the long-term success of open source projects like this. So if we look at some really successful open source projects, like ImageJ, Fiji, RepRap, Arduino, Raspberry Pi, what do they all have in common? They're easy to access, they're cheap or free, but they also have a huge community behind them. So what do you do if you have a problem on ImageJ? You go to the forum. What do you do if you have a problem with Arduino? You go to the forum, or you go to YouTube, and you rely on your community for help and support. And that brings us to my final tip, which is not really a tip, it's more of a lesson or a mistake that we made. Because as it stands, we have these individual communities, but we haven't allowed them to talk to each other and rely on each other. We haven't introduced them to each other. So I think the next step would be to bridge that gap, let them talk to each other and help each other out. And I think that will help this project survive. Because if we look at what makes open source projects fail, often it's the creators of the projects, they move on to something else, they move positions or something, PhD students leave, money runs out, and the support from the project is withdrawn. But if we open this up to the community and the community take ownership of the project, it can survive. And we've tried to create this ownership a little bit with this project by saying, this is your microscope, you keep it, you do whatever you want with it, it's your decision. And also, we're going to help and support you to make sure you feel like you're the master of the EnderScope. And this will hopefully make them feel like they are part of the community and they can take this project and run it. So for me today, I'm the person here telling you this story about the EnderScope. But if this kind of approach works, hopefully I will become irrelevant to this story and it won't be my story anymore. And that's what we want. That would be a good thing. And the text is all messed up here, but I would like to thank, basically, these are all the people that have contributed to this project, my supervisor and all the kind of co-authors, the people that helped me with the code and all the things that I couldn't do. And thank you again to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak.